In 2022, 39 years after he threw his final pitch, Jim Kaat was elected to the Hall of Fame by the Golden Days Era Committee. Is he a deserving Hall of Famer? Traditionalists would say yes. His 283 wins rank 31st all-time, putting him in the company of Robin Roberts, Fergie Jenkins, and Red Ruffing. Sabermetric nerds would say no. His 50.5 wins above replacement rank 107th all-time among pitchers, putting him in the company of Kenny Rogers, Mark Langston, and Roy Oswalt. And sabermetric nerds would say yes. His 75.7 wins above replacement ranked 29th all-time among pitchers, putting him in the company of Robin Roberts, Max Scherzer, and Tom Glavine. Wait, what? Many people, including myself, often talk about WAR as if it is a single stat, but there's actually many methods of measuring wins above replacement. The concept dates back to the 80s, largely from the mind of Bill James, but the first metric to garner significant attention was value over replacement player, or VORP, which was developed by Keith Woolner in 1995. The idea behind VORP was to create a metric that considers all aspects of the game and could serve as an indicator of a player's overall value relative to a replacement player. From VORP came WARP, wins above replacement player, which was introduced by Baseball Prospectus in 2001. In 2002, Bill James published the book Win Shares, which introduced a metric of the same name. Similar to WARP, Win Shares aimed to quantify how much a player contributed to his team's success. In 2008, two new methods of quantifying wins above replacement were published, just 1 month apart from each other. In November, Sean Smith, who sometimes went by the nickname Rally Monkey, introduced what would soon be referred to as Rally Monkey WAR, or rWAR for short. The following month, FanGraphs introduced their own version of WAR, FanGraphs WAR, or fWAR for short. Baseball Prospectus does still use WARP, and every now and then you may hear someone reference win shares, but fWAR and rWAR, which is now also called Baseball Reference WAR, or bWAR, since it's the version of WAR that Baseball Reference has adopted, have become the two most popular measures of wins above replacement. Usually, if someone mentions a player's WAR without specifying which one, they're talking about Baseball Reference WAR. The ambiguity doesn't matter too much though, because for most players, the difference between their rWAR and their fWAR is insignificant. Of the top 100 position players by rWAR, only 17 players have a difference greater than 8% from their career rWAR to their career fWAR. That being said, there are two positions where rWAR and fWAR do tend to differ. The first is catcher, specifically from 2008 to present. This is largely due to differences in the way that fWAR and rWAR quantify defense. rWAR uses defensive runs saved for all seasons after 2002, while fWAR uses ultimate zone rating. For catchers, DRS includes pitch framing, while UZR does not. However, when calculating WAR, Baseball Reference removes the framing component from DRS, in order to create a more fair comparison to catchers that played prior to 2008 when framing data is unavailable. FanGraphs, on the other hand, added framing to their WAR calculation in 2019. All catcher seasons from 2008 to present now include a framing component, and as a result, some modern catchers have significant differences in their fWAR and rWAR. Brian McCann, for example, was worth a similar amount of wins above replacement on Baseball Reference and FanGraphs from 2008 to 2018 prior to FanGraphs adding framing. After the change, his fWAR over this period increased by 18.8 wins. The other position where rWAR and fWAR tend to differ is pitcher. The goal of both WARs is the same: determine how much value the pitcher himself provides to his team. And both WARs account for many of the same factors in order to do this. They both adjust for era, they both adjust for ballpark, and they both attempt to remove team defense from the equation. They differ in how they account for these things though, especially when it comes to team defense. The concept of removing defense when evaluating pitcher performance isn't new. Earned run average has been an official stat since 1912, and it's one of the most popular pitcher stats today. The idea behind using earned run average instead of just run average is that pitchers shouldn't be punished for errors made by their fielders, because those runs aren't earned by the pitcher. Neither fWAR nor rWAR use ERA, however. Instead, the primary stat in FanGraphs pitcher WAR calculation is fielding independent pitching, often abbreviated as FIP, which is a measure of a pitcher's performance that follows the same scale as ERA, but only takes into account strikeouts, walks, hit batsmen, and home runs allowed. The rationale for this is to remove fielding from the equation completely, and to focus only on outcomes that are in the pitcher's control. Baseball Reference, on the other hand, uses runs allowed per 9 innings pitched as the base for pitching WAR. This is then adjusted based on the pitcher's team's overall defensive performance that season, using total zone for seasons before 2003 and defensive runs saved for seasons since 2003. For most pitchers, the difference in calculation method leads to only minor differences in WAR. But large differences can be observed in some cases, especially for pitchers with unusual careers. Take Nolan Ryan, for example. He walked a ton of batters, which impacts his FIP negatively, but he didn't allow many home runs, and over 35% of his recorded outs came from strikeouts. As a result, he has the 8th best FIP of the live ball era, and he did it over a whopping 5,386 innings pitched. However, Ryan allowed a lot of runs in ways that FIP doesn't account for. He threw 277 wild pitches during his career, which is the most of the live ball era by a significant margin. Ryan also allowed 757 stolen bases during his career, which is also the most of the live ball era. That's 1,034 free bases given up, hundreds of which surely led to runs, either directly or indirectly, that fWAR does not take into account. rWAR does factor this in, however, since any run that crosses the plate while a pitcher is on the mound counts against that pitcher. While Nolan Ryan's career FIP is 2.97, his career ERA is 3.19, and his career runs allowed per 9 innings pitched is 3.64. So mystery solved, right? Well, not exactly. Nolan Ryan's career was an extreme outlier in every way, but the only thing that stands out about Kaat's career is its length. Jim Kaat wasn't a prolific strikeout pitcher. He didn't even reach 2,500 career strikeouts despite pitching over 4,500 innings. He didn't give away tons of free bases via wild pitches or stolen bases the way that Ryan did. On the surface, nothing about his stat sheet suggests that he would be the type of pitcher that fWAR and rWAR would disagree on so strongly. In fact, his career FIP and ERA are within 4 points of each other. So why the 25-point difference in WAR? As discussed, rWAR does not use ERA. It uses runs allowed per 9 innings pitched, and then independently controls for defense. Therefore, both earned and unearned runs are counted, and Jim Kaat allowed a lot of unearned runs. His 300 career unearned runs are the second most by a pitcher since integration. 14.7% of the total runs that Kaat allowed in his career were unearned. While Kaat's career ERA was 3.45, his career RA per 9 was 4.05. But remember, even though Baseball Reference WAR counts all runs, it includes an adjustment for team defense. If Kaat had poor defensive teams behind him, it should not negatively impact his rWAR, even if he did allow a lot of unearned runs. The defensive adjustment should make up for it. Just look at Phil Niekro. He's allowed the most unearned runs since integration, yet his career rWAR is significantly higher than his career fWAR. I don't think we have our answer just yet. We need to dig deeper. Let's go through Kaat's career together and see if we can figure out why Baseball Reference and FanGraphs disagree so strongly about his value. For this exercise, we are going to look only at pitching WAR. Kaat also added a few wins to his career WAR total with his batting, but Baseball Reference and FanGraphs largely agree on his batting value, so we don't need to dissect it. Jim Kaat made his MLB debut for the Washington Senators in 1959, at just 20 years of age. He only pitched 5 innings that season, however, and he only pitched 50 innings for the Senators the following season, so let's skip ahead to 1961, when Kaat became a full-time starting pitcher for the Senators. Wait, no, that's not right. Prior to the 1961 season, the Senators moved from Washington to Minnesota and changed their name to the Twins. The American League expanded that same offseason, and 2 new teams were added. One in Los Angeles, actually, Anaheim. No wait, Los Angeles was right, let's go back to that. And another in Washington, the city that the Senators had just left. And the new Washington team named themselves the Senators. And they played in the same stadium that the old Senators played in the season before. But all the 1960 Senators now played for the Twins, not the 1961 Senators. Anyway, in 1961, Jim Kaat was worth 2.1 rWAR and 3.8 fWAR as a pitcher. However, the difference for this season specifically seems to be more straightforward than the rest of his career. In his first full season, Kaat had a 3.90 ERA and a 4.72 RA per 9, but a 3.53 FIP. Kaat's Twins were below average defensively that season, with negative 14 total zone fielding runs as a team, but even with this factored in, his FIP was so much better than his run prevention stats in 1961 that the defensive adjustment isn't enough for his rWAR to catch up to his fWAR. For the 1962 season, FanGraphs and Baseball Reference both give Kaat 5.4 pitching WAR, so let's skip ahead to 1963. As a pitcher, Kaat was worth negative 0.6 rWAR in 1963, but 1.9 fWAR. Similar to 1961, the difference here may be due to a gap between runs allowed and FIP. Kaat's FIP in 1963 was 3.84, but his ERA was 4.19, and his RA per 9 was 4.85. 13.5% of his runs allowed were unearned. For context, only 11.1% of all runs allowed in the American League in 1963 were unearned, so Kaat allowed more unearned runs than average. No big deal. If Kaat had poor defensive teams behind him, then the defense adjustment should make up for it. The only problem is that the 1963 Twins were actually a very good defensive team according to Total Zone. They were worth 36 total zone fielding runs, which ranked 3rd in the American League that season. Therefore, despite Kaat allowing a higher than average number of unearned runs, the team defense adjustment actually decreased Kaat's 1963 rWAR. The Twins had 6 pitchers throw over 100 innings in 1963. The only pitcher with a higher than average percentage of his runs being unearned was Jim Kaat. The logical assumption here is that the Twins fielders allowed more batters to reach base on errors when Kaat was on the mound than when other pitchers were on the mound. But that wasn't actually the case in 1963. The number of batters that reached base on an error per inning pitched for Kaat and Lee Stang were almost identical, and Jim Perry was only slightly behind. Ultimately, other than Stigman, the differences in the number of batters that reached on errors among Twins pitchers was negligible. The 1963 Twins allowed runners to reach on errors at a similar rate for 5 of their top 6 pitchers by innings pitched. That said, errors that allow batters to reach base when they otherwise would not have are not the only kind of errors. There are also errors that allow runners to advance additional bases, and a few of Kaat's unearned runs in 1963 came from those type of errors. On April 20th, Pete Ward of the Chicago White Sox led off the bottom of the 4th inning against Kaat by reaching on a fielding error by second baseman Bernie Allen. Allen then threw the ball away, allowing Ward to advance to second. He was charged with 2 errors on the play. Kaat then walked the next batter, Cam Carrion. Frank Bowman came to bat next and hit a ground ball back to Kaat. Kaat threw to third for the force out. Mike Hirschberger then hit a ball to left field where it was misplayed by outfielder Jimmy Hall. Hirschberger was given a single. Bowman advanced to third on an E7, and Carrion scored an unearned run. Nellie Fox came up next and smacked a base hit to left field. He was thrown out trying to stretch his single into a double, but both Baumann and Hirschberger scored. One of the 2 runs was unearned. Floyd Robinson then ended the inning by grounding out to Kaat. The Twins made 3 errors in the inning, one of which was a player reaching on an error. The only hits that Kaat allowed were 2 singles, yet he gave up 3 runs, 2 of which were unearned. The Twins made a total of 5 errors in this game while Kaat was on the mound. On July 7th, Jim Kaat came in as a reliever in the bottom of the 9th inning of a tied game 3-3 against the Baltimore Orioles. He allowed 2 hits in the 9th, but got out of the inning without allowing any runs. After the Twins failed to score in the top of the 10th, Kaat came back out to pitch the bottom of the 10th. He walked the leadoff hitter, Bob Savarine, and was then replaced by Lee Stang. The runner on first base was Kaat's responsibility, since it was Kaat that had put him on base. Orioles outfielder Al Smith came up to bat against Stang and laid down what was supposed to be a sacrifice bunt. I have no idea what kind of ridiculous error the first baseman made here, since there's no video of the game, but it somehow allowed Savarine to score all the way from first, on a bunt, winning the game for Baltimore. Kaat was credited with an unearned run and the loss. On September 1st, Jim Kaat allowed 2 more unearned runs, despite 0 players reaching on errors. In the 2nd inning, White Sox catcher Cam Carrion doubled to left field. Pete Ward scored from third base, and Al Weiss scored from first base thanks to an error by Twins second baseman Bernie Allen. Kaat then got the next batter to ground out, ending the inning. The very next inning, White Sox center fielder Jim Landis led off with a single. He moved to second on a sacrifice bunt by Floyd Robinson, then moved to third on a passed ball by catcher Earl Batty. Kaat got Dave Nicholson to pop out, but surrendered a single to the next batter, Jim Lemon. Landis came in to score an unearned run. Kaat then ended the inning by getting the next batter, Pete Ward, to line out to center field. This seems like Kaat was just experiencing bad luck. Luck can be a factor in baseball over a small sample size, but eventually, the number of errors made by your fielders should regress to the mean as the sample size gets larger. There's no way this continued to happen for the rest of his career, right? In 1964, Jim Kaat had a 3.28 FIP and a 3.22 ERA. Yet, his FanGraphs pitching WAR was 4.7, while his Baseball Reference pitching WAR was only 3.0. Kaat once again allowed an above-average number of unearned runs, with 13% of his runs being unearned compared to a league average of 10.9%. And, just like 1963, Kaat got no relief from the team defense adjustment, as the Twins were an above-average defensive team in 1964 according to Total Zone. Kaat wasn't the only Twins pitcher allowing a lot of unearned runs this time, though. In fact, Mudcat Grant and Camilo Pascual were even bigger victims of the Twins' inconsistent defense. Furthermore, despite Total Zone rating the Twins as a decent defensive team, they made the second most errors in the American League in 1964. How can this be? How can a team that makes so many errors and allows so many unearned runs to score be considered decent defensively? How is this fair to the Twins' pitchers? I think there's an important part of the equation that we have yet to consider. Which players on the team are good defenders, and which ones are not? After all, good defense looks different for players that play different positions. Infielders mostly deal with ground balls, and good defense involves getting to balls, fielding them cleanly, and making accurate throws. If infielders bobble the ball when trying to field it or make an inaccurate throw, they're given an error. However, if they are unable to get to a ball in the first place due to poor range, it's usually scored as a base hit. Accordingly, poor infield defense may or may not result in an error depending on why the play was not made. For outfielders, errors aren't a huge factor. Since an outfielder's job is mostly to cover ground and get to balls, range is a much more important aspect of outfield defense than anything else. Obviously, dropping balls and making throwing errors aren't good, but these types of mistakes don't happen very often for outfielders, and they ultimately have much less of an impact on the game than range does. But when outfielders aren't able to get to balls due to poor range, those batted balls aren't scored as errors, they're scored as base hits. Therefore, pitchers with good defensive infielders may allow fewer unearned runs, as those infielders will be less likely to make fielding and throwing errors. But teams with good defensive outfielders will allow fewer earned runs, since those outfielders will allow fewer balls to land for base hits. The best defender on the 1964 Twins, according to Total Zone, was center fielder Jimmy Hall. The second best defender was right fielder Tony Oliva. The third best defender was Bob Allison, who split time between first base and outfield. In other words, the strongest part of the Twins' defense was their outfield, except for left fielder Harmon Killebrew. Shortstop Zoilo Versalles was the Twins' second worst defender in 1964, behind Killebrew. He was also the player that fielded the most batted balls and the player that made the most errors. I don't think the defensive adjustment did Jim Kaat dirty in 1964. Kaat and his teammates Mudcat Grant and Camilo Pascual allowed a lot of unearned runs due to poor infield defense. But they likely gave up fewer earned runs than expected, thanks to strong outfield defense. In 1965, Jim Kaat was worth 4.3 fWAR with a 3.35 FIP. His 2.83 ERA was significantly better than his FIP. Yet, with a 2.83 ERA and a 1.26 ERA plus over 264 and a third innings pitched, Jim Kaat was worth 0.4 rWAR in 1965. Jim Kaat allowed an absurd 38 unearned runs in 1965. 31.4% of the total runs that he allowed that season were unearned. While his ERA was 2.83, his runs allowed per 9 innings was 4.12. In 1965, the Twins were the second best defensive team not only in the American League, but in all of Major League Baseball, according to Total Zone. They trailed the Baltimore Orioles by just 2 total zone runs. Every single starting player on the team rated above average defensively, led by shortstop Zoilo Versalles, who would win a Gold Glove and the AL MVP award that season. Despite this, the Twins led the American League in errors in 1965. This may seem impossible, but errors as a stat don't really tell you much about a player's or team's overall defensive ability. There are 2 main reasons for this. The first is that errors are subjective. They're scored based on someone's opinion of whether or not the play was an error. Therefore, they cannot possibly be consistent across the league. The second, and more important reason, goes back to what we were discussing before: range. Players that get to more balls will inevitably make more errors. Players that get to fewer balls have fewer opportunities to make errors. A player or team having a high number of errors does not always mean that they are poor defensively. Sometimes it just means that they field more balls than other teams do. If player A got to 20 more balls than player B did, but he made 5 more errors than player B did, he was still responsible for 15 more outs than player B was. Player B made 5 fewer errors, but he allowed 15 more base hits to get by him. 28 batters reached base on errors while Kaat was pitching in 1965. This number is more than double the amount for any other pitcher on the Twins staff. An extremely low strikeout rate could help to explain this, as more balls in play would inevitably lead to more errors, but Kaat actually had a higher strikeout rate than Mudcat Grant and Jim Perry, who, along with Kaat, made up the Twins' top 3 pitchers in innings pitched. Maybe Kaat had a higher ground ball rate then? Ground balls are more likely to result in errors than fly balls. It seems like that may have been a factor, as Kaat induced more ground balls per inning pitched in 1965 than any of the other Twins pitchers with at least 100 innings pitched, but his ground ball rate was pretty similar to Mudcat Grant's. And, as we've established, Kaat had twice as many opposing batters reach on errors than Grant did, despite the two pitching a similar number of innings. Looking at the play-by-play for some of Kaat's games in 1965, it's hard to deny that some of Kaat's unearned runs may have been the result of plain bad luck. However, Kaat also seemed to have a hard time bailing out his teammates when they did make an error. Kaat's start against the Cleveland Indians on April 28th, his fourth start of the season, serves as a good example. In the first inning, Kaat quickly retired the first two batters via a groundout and a flyout. The third batter, Leon Wagner, hit a ground ball to second baseman Cesar Tovar. Thanks to an E4, Wagner not only reached base, but advanced to second. Instead of a 1-2-3 inning, Kaat had to face Indians cleanup hitter Rocky Colavito with a runner in scoring position. Colavito singled to center field, driving in Wagner. Max Alvis came up to bat next and hit a 2-run home run. One error turned a 1-2-3 inning into 3 unearned runs. Sure, the error put a runner in scoring position, but it was Kaat that allowed the subsequent single and home run, not the Twins fielders. In the third inning of the same game, Dick Hauser hit a fly ball to Tony Oliva. Oliva couldn't field the ball, and the E9 allowed Hauser not only to reach, but to make it all the way to third base. Chuck Hinton then drove in Hauser with a single to left field. Leon Wagner came up next, and Kaat induced a ground ball for a double play. After a walk to Rocky Colavito, Kaat appeared to have gotten out of the inning after a fly ball was hit to left field. But left fielder Bob Allison made another error, allowing Colavito to advance to third, Alvis to reach with 2 bases, and the inning to continue. Vic Davalillo then singled to left field, driving in both Colavito and Alvis. Kaat gave up one more single to Larry Brown before being taken out of the game. Johnny Klipstein came in to pitch in relief, and he got Joe Askew to ground out to end the inning. Kaat pitched 2 2/3 innings. In those 2 2/3 innings, his team made 3 errors. 6 runs scored. All 6 of them were unearned. On July 25th, Kaat pitched against the Baltimore Orioles. Orioles center fielder Jackie Brandt led off the bottom of the first inning with a ground ball to third base. Instead of a groundout, Brandt landed on second base after a misplay by Harmon Killebrew. Kaat then gave up a single to Norm Seaburn, leaving runners on first and third with no outs. Bob Johnson then hit another grounder to third base, and Brandt tried to score from third. Killebrew was able to throw him out at home plate. Brooks Robinson came up to bat next and flew out to right field. The inning would have been over had Killebrew not made the initial error that allowed Brandt to reach. Instead, Kurt Blefari came to bat and hit a single to left field, driving in Seaburn. Kaat then struck out Boog Powell to end the inning. 1 inning pitched, 1 error, 1 unearned run. Kaat retired the first batter in the bottom of the second, Jerry Adair, with a pop-out to second base. Dick Brown then hit a single, giving the Orioles a runner on first with 1 out. John Miller then came to bat and hit a grounder to Gold Glove and MVP shortstop Zoilo Versalles. Instead of an inning-ending double play, however, Versalles made an error, and both runners were safe. Kaat got the next batter, Jackie Brandt, to hit a grounder back to the mound. Kaat fielded the ball and threw to second for the force out. But then Norm Seaburn singled to center field, driving in Brown from third. Bob Johnson followed it up with a triple, driving in both Brandt and Seaburn. Kaat was then taken out of the game and replaced by Mel Nelson, who was able to escape the inning with a flyout from Brooks Robinson. Kaat pitched 1 2/3 innings. His team made 2 errors. 4 runs scored. All 4 of them were unearned. The story was mostly the same on September 30th against the Orioles, although Kaat was at least able to pitch deeper into the game this time. In the bottom of the third inning, Kaat had 2 outs with a runner on second. A passed ball allowed the runner to move to third, and a single allowed him to score an unearned run. In the bottom of the 7th, leadoff batter Jerry Adair reached on an error by Zoilo Versalles. He would score an unearned run 2 batters later, after a Kurt Blefari double and a Dick Brown fielder's choice. After retiring the next batter, Bob Johnson, Kaat would surrender 3 straight singles, allowing 3 more runs, 2 of which were unearned, to score. He was then replaced by Al Worthington. He allowed 5 total runs in the game. 4 of the 5 were unearned. Kaat certainly didn't get much help from his fielders in 1965. But his fielders also didn't get much help from him. While 1965 is the most extreme example, the majority of Kaat's tenure with the Twins followed a similar pattern. Lots of unearned runs allowed, despite good team defense overall. In August of 1973, in the midst of a rough season, the Twins put Jim Kaat on waivers, and he was claimed by the Chicago White Sox. Kaat ended his Twins/Senators tenure with 3,014 and a third innings pitched for the franchise across 15 seasons. 16.8% of the runs that he allowed while pitching for the Twins franchise were unearned. His RA per 9 with the Twins was 67 points higher than his ERA. His FIP and ERA were only 1 point apart, yet FanGraphs credits him with 53.4 pitching WAR as a Twin, and Baseball Reference credits him with only 30.6 pitching WAR. Kaat quickly made the Twins regret giving up on him, as he was fantastic in his first full season in Chicago in 1974. He was worth 7.1 Baseball Reference pitching WAR, the highest of his career, and 4.8 FanGraphs pitching WAR, the 5th highest of his career. For Kaat, the switch from Minnesota to Chicago also came with a switch in which measure of WAR liked him more. The biggest change, of course, was team defense. In 1974, the White Sox were worth the fewest total zone runs of any team in the American League. Yet, despite 20 batters reaching on errors in 1964, Kaat did a better job of picking up his fielders in Chicago than he did in Minnesota. He still allowed a lot of unearned runs, but the 15.1% of his runs that were unearned in 1974 was a lower rate than the 16.8% during his 15 years as a Twin. There were only 3 instances all season in which Kaat allowed more than 1 unearned run from a single error, and there were 9 instances in which a player reached on an error, but Kaat did not allow any unearned runs to score. Kaat's ERA was lower than his FIP in 1974, just like it had been in many of his seasons with the Twins. But with his RA per 9 being only 52 points higher than his ERA, compared to the 67-point gap between the two stats during his time in Minnesota, and with the defensive adjustment boosting his rWAR instead of lessening it, Kaat's rWAR was higher than his fWAR for the first time in his long career. Then, it happened again in 1975. Still with the White Sox, Kaat posted a 7.7 pitching rWAR season, a new career high. FanGraphs credited him with only 5.1 pitching WAR in 1975, his 5th highest season by fWAR. Everything that can be said about Kaat's 1974 season can also be said about 1975. His ERA was lower than his FIP, the White Sox were awful fielders according to Total Zone, and Kaat allowed a lower percentage of unearned runs than he did in Minnesota. Following the 1975 season, the White Sox traded Kaat to the Philadelphia Phillies, where his age started to catch up with him. Kaat pitched in 8 more seasons from 1976 to 1983 with the Phillies, Yankees, and Cardinals, but he wasn't the same pitcher that he once was. Over his last 8 seasons, Kaat's performance on the mound earned him negative 0.6 rWAR and 6.8 fWAR. As mentioned at the onset of this video, Jim Kaat ended his career with 50.5 rWAR and 75.7 fWAR. His nearly 50% increase from his rWAR to his fWAR is the largest percent difference in either the positive or negative direction of any player with at least 50 rWAR. He is the only player with at least 50 rWAR to have an increase of over 30% from rWAR to fWAR. While this exercise may have given us a better understanding of Jim Kaat's career, I think it ultimately raises more questions than it answers. The most obvious of those being, which WAR is right? And I don't think that's a question that I can answer. Both versions of WAR have been meticulously crafted and tweaked by people far more intelligent and more informed than me. They both seek to accomplish the same goal of measuring overall player value, and both have, in my opinion, sound methods for achieving that goal. I don't think you can say that either version of WAR is right or wrong. Rather, I think you can only have a preference about which methodology you believe is more likely to produce an accurate and reliable result, and this preference will naturally vary from person to person. I personally have a slight preference for rWAR, since I think run prevention is the ultimate goal of a pitcher, and I think that fWAR's reliance on FIP excludes too many factors that can lead to runs. However, when it comes to players like Jim Kaat that have such a significant difference between the stats, maybe it's best to consider both. Maybe the player's true value is somewhere in the middle. I think some people that already have the preconceived notion that WAR is useless may think that this video helps to prove their argument, but I want to state unequivocally that if that's your takeaway, then you've missed the point. In fact, I would argue that Jim Kaat is a great example of why WAR is so beneficial. Both rWAR and fWAR are great for a few things, including comparing players across eras and getting a quick idea of a player's overall value, but the most important function of WAR, in my opinion, is that it brings our attention to things that we may have otherwise overlooked. When a player's WAR does not align with your prior understanding of that player's ability, The course of action should not be to dismiss WAR as wrong because you know better. Instead, look into why this discrepancy exists. What did this player do well or poorly that you didn't notice before, that caused his WAR to be higher or lower than you expected? Maybe you'll change your mind, maybe you won't, but either way, you'll definitely be more informed about that player than you were before. In Kaat's case, it may not be a gap between WAR and our preconceived notions, but rather between the two WARs that pique our curiosity. And because of that, we now understand him better, and we can draw our own conclusions about his value. And of course, we have the question that we opened with. Is Jim Kaat a deserving Hall of Famer? Honestly, I'm not sure. It's very close in my opinion, and I've changed my mind a few times. I am leaning in a particular direction right now though, and if you want to know what that direction is, be sure to subscribe and keep an eye out for my next video. I teased this next video all the way back last year when I released my Jim Devlin video, but I'm finally going to work on the video where I discuss the Hall of Fame, explain the many flaws that the Hall of Fame has, propose some solutions, and list the players that would and would not make my personal Hall of Fame. So be sure to subscribe and keep an eye out for that. If you feel passionately one way or another about Jim Kaat's Hall of Fame worthiness, make your case in the comments. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts.